Hello everyone and welcome to our Rising to the Challenge webinar series. I'm Michelle Mitchell, I'm the Chief Exec of Cancer Research UK. Wherever you are in the world, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you for being part of our webinar today, and we certainly are in for a big treat. So it's my pleasure to invite our much loved and distinguished scientific leader, Sir Paul Nurse, and our good friend and lifetime supporter and television broadcaster, Tania Bryer, to lead us in a conversation on science, innovation, scientific challenges and opportunities, and the critical role of biomedical research in our health and well-being. As a Nobel Prize winner, Director of the Francis Crick Institute and Chair of Cancer Grand Challenges Scientific Advisory Panel, I am pretty certain, in fact I'm definite, that Paul has overcome many challenges that have been put in front of him, and we are honoured to work with him on so many key Cancer Research UK initiatives. And Tania, moving to Tania, has always, thank you for your time and for all that you do for Cancer Research UK. You've been a tremendous, absolutely tremendous support and source of energy as the chair of our National Events Committee. We all recognise these are challenging times for many, including Cancer Research UK, but together we will come through this current crisis and build towards a better and stronger future and continue our focus on, of course, beating cancer together. So I'm certainly looking forward on a hot day to a dynamic conversation, and we will welcome your questions and comments a little later in the discussion. But for now, thank you for joining, and I will now hand over to Tania.
Michelle, thank you so much, and welcome to everybody who is on our special webinar today. Wherever you are in the world, wherever you are in your house, I hope you're keeping safe and well, and really we appreciate your time. As Michelle says, it's very challenging times for everyone, and during this pandemic, we'd like to, over this hour, share the research and how our researchers are rising to that challenge. Focusing on the toughest challenges in science, there's no one better to talk to us than the incredible Sir Paul Nurse, Nobel Laureate, Director of the Francis Crick Institute and Chair of the Cancer Grand Challenges Funding Initiative. He's going to be discussing, as Michelle said, the challenges faced today, also in his career and in science in general. So over the next 25 minutes, I'll be talking to Sir Paul, but we would love your questions. So all of you who's joining us today, and please, it's very informal, so don't be shy, just get your questions in. We'd love to hear from you. And then on the second 30 minutes, I'll be relaying your questions to Sir Paul. So anything that you've ever wanted to ask him, now's your chance. Sir Paul, you lead the Francis Crick Institute in London, you chair the Cancer Grand Challenges Scientific Committee, lead research laboratories in London and New York with research that has been recognised with so many different honours, and of course including a Nobel Prize. Now this webinar series is entitled Rising to the Challenge. So I'd like to ask you some questions about your own challenges, the challenges we face today. And let's start with the current challenge, if I may, Sir Paul, COVID-19, specifically focusing on people living with cancer. What has been the impact on them, and how is the pandemic affecting them and, of course, their treatment?
Well, Tania, I mean, thank you for asking that question. The truth is, they've been affected very adversely by the current crisis, perhaps in ways that were not imagined before a pandemic like this. We know that the numbers of medical treatments for cancer patients have dropped dramatically, that they're not going to get treatment, they're not going to hospital, and there's various reasons for this. Partly, I think, because they're frightened to go to a place which they may not think is safe, partly because the hospitals weren't organized well to be able to deal with cancer patients as well as COVID patients. And what we're going to see, and it's something that I think should really worry all of us, that the COVID is not simply going to be harming and in some cases killing patients suffering from the virus, but also cancer patients who are not getting treated properly. And that there will be a real toll that we will count up at the end of the crisis, which is very sad indeed.
It must frustrate you, Paul, though, knowing this. And, you know, are the government doing anything to support it?
Well, it's difficult for the government. Let's be quite frank about it. This is a difficult situation. The pandemic is very significant. It has disturbed society. I'm not sure that in fact, I'm pretty certain that they weren't prepared well enough. At the beginning of a pandemic, the only thing you have in your armory is in fact testing, and our testing really was put in place rather slowly, and so we are suffering because of that. But at this moment, we all have to help. We all have to try and see what we can do to get out of the present crisis.
Absolutely, Paul. And how has the pandemic actually affected the work at CRUK and the Crick? And what have you been working on to support the actual COVID-19 efforts?
Well, the first thing we did is, in fact, reduce the numbers of people here so that we didn't have crowding and a consequence of potential spreading of the infection. Then what we decided to do, and we did it quite early, was to try and contribute to the national effort of dealing with COVID. So we're a research laboratory, but what we did is to repurpose part of it so that we could carry out testing to be able to detect people who are suffering from the virus. So we put in place what's called the PCR reaction that detects the RNA that's in the virus, so we can detect whether an individual is infected by the virus. And the purpose of doing this was quite simple, really. It was to test frontline medical staff working in local hospitals, local care homes, support staff like ambulance men, even those out like community nurses, so that we would know who was infected and therefore should be taken out of the front line so that they didn't infect others, particularly vulnerable patients, or for that matter, their colleagues, which would reduce the numbers of people who could take care of the patients. And that was something we did in actually a couple of weeks, really. We repurposed the laboratory. We rapidly were doing had the capacity to do a couple of thousand tests every day, and this was a significant contribution. And as a consequence, we have been supporting 6 or 7 local hospitals in North London, care homes and ambulance men and so on, as I've said. And what's really important about this is 2 things, really. One is it's local, so we're well connected. The second is we're rapid. We get answers back within 24 hours. And compared with for example, the bigger labs that have been set up in various places around the country, where I'm hearing the turnaround time is 4 or 5 days, what we do, turning around in 24 hours, is getting frontline staff away from patients within a day. So they're not hanging around there for a number of days, potentially infecting other patients and also medically other care workers. So that's been our major contribution. But in addition to doing that, we've set up a number of research projects. Perhaps a dozen of our labs have carried out research projects, includes my own, in fact. I redirected 5 of my graduate students to help another laboratory who was doing related work, and they're purifying the proteins that make up the virus and working out assays to allow screening for drugs. So we're actually really quite heavily involved. We have around 300 people in the Institute, and a significant number of them are doing direct work for COVID.
Well, that's great to hear, Paul, that you're so focused on that as well. And I just want to ask you, what is your biggest worry about the virus going forward?
Well, I think the biggest worry is how are we really going to be able to manage the fact that the virus kills some people, and it's difficult to predict who's going to be really severely affected by that virus, and we don't know enough about it. And as a consequence of that, it can't be ignored. It's not just like influenza. We shouldn't ignore influenza either, by the way, but this is more deadly, and it is actually breaking down the structure of our society, because the only way we can really manage it at this moment, and actually for many months to come, is to test and isolate people when they are infected, so we can keep the rate of infection down. That's why testing was so critically important. So my real worry is that we have to survive quite a few months probably, using just testing, and we may not have the testing capacity or the effectiveness in running the testing capacity to actually keep this properly managed over those months. Subsequently, we hope we'll have a vaccine or some treatments, but that's still some way off. And of course, people are working very hard on it throughout the world. But till we have that in place, all we have is testing. And somehow we've got to get moving again in that situation. So that's my biggest worry.
Well, Paul, let's hope the government listened to you. I think they've announced today more antibody testing for NHS and frontline workers. What I'd like to do now, if you don't mind, Paul, is just to concentrate on you a little bit, because because you obviously have a very distinguished career. And I just wanted to know, where did that passion for science come from?
Well, I've always been intensely curious, I think the truth is. I came from quite an ordinary family, working class family. I was the youngest child. I had two brothers and a sister. We lived in Wembley, where the stadium is. From a very early age, I was fascinated with the natural world. I remember getting really interested in the stars and looking at the planets. I saw Sputnik 2, I'm of that age, flashing across the sky. That had a big impact on me. I used to walk to school and took notice of the seasons, the butterflies, how the plants went. And I wanted to know how everything worked. I had a passionate interest, curiosity in how it all worked. And I didn't know it was called science at that time, but it was science. And I think that's where the origins of my scientific career began.
But when you were standing up there receiving a Nobel Prize for science, Paul, I mean, did you think to yourself, how did this happen?
Well, I did. And, you know, let me say something. I mean, there's quite a lot of luck in getting a Nobel Prize. I'm not trying to diminish it. I mean, I was delighted and pleased to have it. But there are many of my colleagues who are doing work of an equivalent level. You have to be in the right place, the right time. They have to have the right numbers, not too many, and it has to be significant. And I was just very lucky. And I'm pleased about it because, well, frankly, most ordinary people have only heard of one scientific prize, and that is the Nobel Prize. And I did get it. I was quite young. I was only just 50, just over 50 years of age. Actually, one of the problems with it was it's like getting another job. And I still was working full time, and I had the other job of being a Nobel laureate. And there are certain problems with that, because suddenly, everyone thinks you know everything, and you have, you know, that they can ask you anything, and you'll give them a sensible answer. And there is perhaps a bit of an issue there, because some Nobel laureates start thinking that they do know everything. I've even named a new disease for it. I call it Nobelitis. That is that you really think you really know everything. And luckily, my family keep me checked and my feet on the ground. But it is actually, bluntly, rather distracting, because I'm sure you probably believe it, but every single day I get an invitation to go somewhere, open something, speak, and so on. And when you don't have the support, and some of my colleagues don't have much support, it's absolutely overwhelming. They can't do any more science again because they're just dealing with all the mail.
What do you think the biggest impact? You've talked about a lot of the changes, what happened after winning it, but what was the biggest impact you think, Paul, had on your life?
Well, I think probably the biggest impact is that I became more of a public figure. I mean, would you be talking to me now if I didn't have a Nobel Prize? Probably less likely. And so and so that meant that that I became more public. I think I enjoy some of that. I think it's very important that scientists are seen to interact with society. Many scientists are not very good at that. I'm okay at doing that, and I think it's important that scientists are seen as being normal people who can be spoken to and who can actually interact in a sensible way, because science is going to impact on our lives in very significant ways increasingly, and we have to have a healthy relationship between science and society, and that means scientists have got to get out there and talk to society. So that's probably the biggest change in my life.
Well, I want to also ask you about the creation of Cancer Research UK, because you were responsible almost 20 years ago for a merger between Imperial Cancer Research Fund and the Cancer Research Campaign. Why did this merger come together, and what was your vision when you brought them together, Paul?
Well, it was brought together, of course, by a number of people. It was my initial idea to do it. I was director of the Imperial Cancer Research Fund and had run it for several years, been director of research before that. And we ran what's called intramural research. We had institutes, research institutes, and also clinical units, and they were in-house. Cancer Research Campaign, the CRC, had a different way of working. They funded research in universities in a what's called response mode grants. That is, you applied for a grant, and if you were awarded a grant, quite competitive, then you would have your work supported, and they would be mainly working in universities throughout the all of the United Kingdom. So they worked in different sorts of ways. And I reasoned sort of two things, really. The first was that they were very complementary. An intramural and extramural program, there's advantages in both, and it made a single organization would make a better way of carrying out that work, and one that was more collaborative. The second reason, which was actually a bit worrying because I wasn't sure I was right, was that in fact we had two organizations who were competing for funding, because they were both run philanthropically. We both had to raise money. And what I didn't like was there was a tendency for these two organizations to compete one with another. And one thing I think that is bad is when organizations are competing and saying we're better than you, and then that just really donors don't like that, and at all levels. And I was getting disturbed by that when I saw that happening. So I thought if we could work as a single organization, then that will all go away because we'd be all working for the same purpose. The real worry for me was that if we had two different funding raising organizations and we put them into one, would the income just drop dramatically or would it go up? What happened was it went up, but it must be said the majority of people in both organizations were very worried about it and thought the total income would go down. But it did work, and my successors, because I ran Cancer Research UK for a short while, I then went to America, and my successors, particularly Harpal Kumar, actually for 10 or more years, really developed Cancer Research UK, and it's now significantly bigger and also better than the two separate organizations in 2000 when I drove them together.
Well, that was your goal and that was your vision, Paul, obviously. And Cancer Research UK, how important is it to the Crick Institute, I want to ask you, to the UK research community, and also to the global cancer research community as well? Because you talk a lot about collaboration.
Well, Cancer Research UK is very important for the Crick. Let me start there. It is, in fact, the organisation that gives us the most money each year. We are core funded by Cancer Research UK, the Medical Research Council, which is the government one step removed, under what's called the UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, and also the Wellcome Trust. The first two give about 100 million between us, very large sums. The Wellcome about 16 million. So this is our core funding, very large sums of money, but CRUK is the biggest. And really, we're utterly dependent on CRUK to operate effectively. And so it's central for us. When you ask about CRUK's role more generally, because it is very effective in the way that it works, and because it has very high standards and runs good quality research, it's making a very significant impact on cancer research and how cancer can be managed as a disease, not only in the UK, but as you also mentioned, through collaborations through the rest of the world. And the grand challenges, which of course we're talking mostly about today, is entirely an international effort. So it's very important on the world stage as well.
Well, let's move on to those, because you've put it beautifully, Paul. You've done the link for me. Thank you so much. The cancer grand challenges, what they are, how important they are, why you've chosen to be involved. It involves researchers from around the world, from the USA to the UK. Of course, you led the Rockefeller University Research Centre. Tell us more about it and what we can achieve.
You mean the Rockefeller University or the new Cancer Research UK Grand Challenges?
Well, if you could just tell us a little bit about your role with the Rockefeller University first, and then we'll go into the Grand Challenges.
Good. I mean, Rockefeller University, which is one of the great research institutions in the United States, in New York. It was a fantastic. Ran it for 8 years. Fantastic experience. It's a very similar in size to the Crick. In fact, we had about 80, 90 research groups. Despite its small size, it had during its history, it had been around for over 100 years, 22 Nobel laureates in chemistry or in medicine. That was more than France, for example, just in that one institution. Today it has 4 Nobel laureates who are still there. Actually, the Crick has 4 Nobel laureates too, so I'm quite pleased about that. 2 who are active and 2 who are emeriti. So I learned a lot from seeing how things worked in the United States, particularly the focus on the individual there. And what I've tried to do is embed some of that philosophy into a more communal way of working in the UK to try and get the best of both worlds. So that was my experience in Rockefeller. Now, with respect to the Cancer Grand Challenges and what CRUK is doing there, this is a really impressive international cancer research platform. It's actually essentially unique. It's what it does is it identifies big challenges that are important for cancer, and asks for bids in those areas from international teams, 5, 6, 7, or even 10 research groups spread around the world. It has to be international, has to be diverse, has to be multidisciplinary, and it tackles big problems. And this is really quite unique. And I know quite a number of those who have been awarded these prizes. I know them personally, and I call them prizes because it's prize funding that supports these grand challenges. And they are really, really good, both sides of the Atlantic particularly, and we hope also to go into the Far East. So very impressed by what's been achieved, and very pleased, honoured even, to be, it's a privilege to be asked to play a leading role in taking that initiative forward.
Paul, are there any early discoveries that have surprised you or demonstrated to you that Cancer Grand Challenges will live up to its vision?
Yes, I don't know if that's surprises, not so many surprises because I knew the competence, the capability of the people doing it. A couple of things come to mind, really. My friend Mike Stratton, who works at the Sanger near Cambridge, that's an institute in Cambridge, or near Cambridge, in the outskirts there. They are looking there at lung cancers. They're looking at the DNA in cells that are found in lung cancer cells. And what they're doing by sequencing those DNA, the DNA molecules from those cells, is identifying what you might call the DNA signatures of lung cancer. In other words, what goes wrong to the DNA, what damage occurs as a consequence of smoking. that gives you the signatures that lead to lung cancer. And this is really interesting because it helps us identify what might be responsible for lung cancer, which is actually rather difficult cancer to treat. And it's really making contributions there. One thing that was interesting already is that when individuals stop smoking, that that damage can be reversed. The cells that are damaged start being diluted out by cells that are not damaged. Cancer is a disease of evolution. In fact, those cancer cells are evolving. And that leads me to another project also carried out by a friend of mine called Greg Hannon. And he's really looking at what you might call the ecology of a tumor cell. Lots of different cells in there, and they all interact one with another. And this is like a little community in a way. It's not the way people think about it. And so ecology is important there, and understanding how that actually connects one with another, looking at single cells of cancer. So both ecology and evolution that you don't normally associate with cancer turn out to be really quite important in thinking about the disease and how it forms. Very exciting work, very high quality.
It does sound very exciting, Paul. And in just a moment, I'm going to open it up to questions from our webinar audience. But just before I do, Paul, when do you think that in your lifetime and our lifetime, we will have a cancer-free society, or be in a society when the word won't frighten the person that's being told they have it?
Well, how I like to think about it is, let's strive for a society where we're no longer frightened of the disease. And we're already part of the way there. When I was a young person, barely nobody spoke about cancer because it was seen as a death sentence. That is no longer the case. And that is partly because we now have the ability to manage increasing numbers of different cancers. Now, the way I like to think about it is like bricks in a wall. I don't talk about magic breakthroughs. I know that often people do, but every year we put another brick in the wall, and over the years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it will gradually get better. We will be able to treat, perhaps eliminate some cancers, manage others, prolong in lives of others, and it will gradually get better. I don't think we will ever eliminate it. I think it will always be with us. But what I'd like to see is a highly managed situation where it no longer is a fear for people who have it.
And Paul, how proud are you of the work of the Crick Cancer Research UK, or the initiatives that you've been involved?
Well, I think Cancer Research UK is a great organisation. I myself have personally benefited from it. I first started working for Imperial Cancer Research Fund in the 1980s, and I've left and come back 3 times over my life, and it's been a great influence to me personally. And what I'm been so pleased to see is just how much impact it has on the world. And of course, at this moment, CRUK, Cancer Research UK, is in some difficulties. I mean, with the 25% drop in income, it is worrying to see that is going to damage cancer research of the highest quality. We will, of course, rebound back, but just at the moment, it's very problematic for CRUK.
Well, Paul, we'll discuss that a bit more later, but first I'd like to get some questions. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to put my glasses on. I'm going to have to get vanity out the window now so I can actually read the questions. And here we go. Paul, I've got lots of questions coming in for you. And the first one I've got is to follow on from the prior question: should the government be doing more to help charities like CRUK? And that's anonymous.
Well, the first thing to say is that the government did announce support for charities in the COVID crisis, but actually it's not support for research. And so Michelle will know much more about this, but I think that they need to do more to recognise that, in fact, the research charities, but cancer research type, Cancer Research UK, cancer research activities are being damaged because the government isn't putting in the money there. In terms of the government support for researching cancer, they do that through the Medical Research Council, and that complements and connects with the work that Cancer Research UK does, and everything works better by collaboration and cooperation, and that's one of the advantages of the CRIC, because we have MRC support, Medical Research Council support, and Cancer Research UK support as well. So yes, the government could do more for cancer, because it is such a deadly disease and many suffer from it, and it's going to be a problem in the coming years because of the damage to our economies that COVID-19 is causing.
Right, thank you, Paul. We've got a question here from Jeff Tobias. Jeff says, hi, Paul. The concept of herd immunity seems largely to have been rubbished in respect of ultimate control of this COVID-19 pandemic. What's your view? And he says, thank you.
Well, herd immunity ultimately may be useful, but at this stage it is not. I mean, if the consequences of the disease have been more minor, then that might have been a way forward. But unfortunately, they're not. There are too many people dying, and you can't use herd immunity. Once we have vaccines, then vaccination combined with herd immunity in a number of years' time, perhaps, will actually be important. Just at this moment, it isn't the strategy to be followed. There's some, I'm not quite sure if it was really being pushed as a strategy or whether it was over-reported. I mean, it certainly was speculated about, and frankly, it could never have been an approach with a pandemic of this type.
Right, we have Dr. Andy Richards. Paul, do you think that there may be some societal and individual changes in the way that people think about healthcare and disease monitoring and having diagnostic tests that may enable the community and the NHS to improve cancer pathways and particularly to facilitate the move to improved early detection and diagnosis that we know is so important, an area which CRUK has been a global champion for?
Well, cancer, as we know, is a disease that if you let it carry on too long without treatment, will often prove fatal. So early detection, as you've just heard from the questioner, is a critical thing that you need to get right. And actually, early diagnosis is one of the areas where you can make progress, because understanding cancer, understanding what's different about a cancer cell versus a normal cell in molecular terms allows you, if you can develop ways of detecting those molecular differences, allows you to actually detect cancer cells in principle much earlier than we could have done 30, 40, 50 years ago. So this is an area where there can be real progress, and knowing that an individual does have cancer at a very early stage will definitely improve outcomes. So it's a very important problem we need to pursue.
And then another question, which is anonymous. Why is collaboration so important to research on this scale? If you gave money to just one group or institute, could they have the same impact?
Well, now this is an interesting question, because there is not a single answer to this, because the reality is that you need both. By which I mean sometimes research is done by a single individual and done very effectively. Sometimes it requires a great collaborative effort because it requires all sorts of disciplines and working closely together. So there isn't an easy answer to that. What you need is a breadth of approaches that, if you like, will support the sole individual pushing forward and also teams pushing forward. You need, bluntly, both sorts of approaches if you're going to cover the range of problems and also the range of people that are involved in this process. Some people work very well working with others, some less well, and work actually better alone. So I think we have to be tolerant of different approaches and encourage these different ways of working, because they complement each other.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Another question is, given the effect the current health crisis is having on the world economy, and that of the UK in particular, and the impact on funding for cancer research and other work at the Crick, are you going to face a double whammy next year as a result of Brexit?
Well, I was not in favour of Brexit because I think that we work better intellectually, scientifically, working in bigger units. And I've worked in Europe, I've worked in Switzerland, and I've worked in Denmark, for example, during my career. And Brexit is a worry for us because my institute here, for example, we had penciled in around £10 million a year from European funds, which will simply disappear. So that's a real concern. I also happen to think that there's three major groupings of scientific research in the world, scientific and medical research: North America, China and Europe. And we, that is in the UK, were leaders of European science. And now we sort of separated ourselves off. We actually have a lot less influence in some of the scientific policy matters that need to be dealt with in the world. So I think on the whole, it's a pretty negative thing that we have to deal with Brexit. And having both Brexit and COVID-19 at the same time is really the double whammy that the questioner mentioned.
But do you think the UK could be left behind, Paul?
Well, I'm not a pessimist. I like to always think that we will get through. I think personally it will be more difficult, but I'm sure we'll get by. And I'm also sure that after some years we will go back into the European Union. I think we've been, I do really, because I think that we will see that it's much easier in the bigger grouping. We will have more impact on the world, greater leadership as a consequence. So I have a feeling this will be reversed. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I think it will happen.
Right, Paul, another question. How much of an impediment is protection of IP interest to the collaboration between academia plus and industry and between nations?
Well, let me talk about academia and industry because the Crick is doing things a bit differently. I've worked in universities, and universities hang on to their intellectual property like grim death. And often the tech transfer companies that are important for managing the transfer of knowledge from academia into industry can be inhibitory in that transfer because they're always wanting to do what I see as little deals so that they can recover small sums of money and get in the way of a sort of open collaboration. So very early on, we decided here to do things a bit differently. We're a discovery research, we're not an applied institution, but we're very open for translation into patient benefit and also economic benefit for the country as a whole. So what we decided to do was to let researchers pursue what they thought was interesting and likely to lead to bigger discoveries, but have a very effective internal scouting system that would try and find things that looked interesting in a commercial way and try and connect to industry in a pre-competitive way before we got all wound up with IP. Because what I think we were reasoning here was it's the chemistry between people that is really important and we need to preserve. The chemistry of a fundamental researcher, which is mostly what we have in the Crick, and a more applied researcher that's in a company. Now, if these people are working together in a more open way and yet are not fighting all the time about IP and who owns what or whatever, then you are much more likely to get progress early on when most of these ventures fail. So we have a very open, close contact with this activity, and we worry very little about making money in the short term. What we want to do is actually push our discoveries out into industry as quickly as possible for overall benefit of society. If we make money later, that's fine, but that isn't our driving force. Our driving force, in a sense, is to make money for other people, but bluntly, to actually get our discoveries into a place where they can be usefully applied. And to help with that, we've actually imported into the Institute tech transfer companies that are linked with both Cancer Research UK, and so they're doing translational activity, research activity for Cancer Research UK, and also what's called LiveArc, which was linked very closely to the Medical Research Council. So we've got, if you like, exemplars within the building from our two major funding partners, so that we can think about doing that even more effectively.
Another question for you, Paul. Are there sufficient PCR instruments for 100,000 or more tests per day? How can we scale it?
Well, this is a very interesting problem, because the strategy, which I think was rather unimaginative, that was employed, was to set up big laboratories that would do large-scale testing. Now, I think we needed those, but because they hadn't been planned before the pandemic, to start from scratch was simply not recognizing that this was going to be a difficult job. Now, what we did as a local laboratory was very rapidly, in a couple of weeks, put testing in place, as I've said, and we could scale instantly to a couple of thousand. That's not 100,000, but why wasn't that laid out? Why wasn't that run out, that approach, to all the other academic and small commercial testing facilities in the country? If you looked at that across the country, there would easily have been 30 or 50 such places that would within weeks have put our testing capacity up to 100,000. Yet the government's activity in just big labs is barely there even now. So that was one problem. The second problem is that there wasn't a concentration, and this isn't science, what I'm going to say. There wasn't a concentration on what I call the workflow, the logistics of getting the tests into the facility, getting them out and back again. It's taking 4 or 5 days in the bigger labs. We do it in less than 24 hours, not because we're brighter or smarter, but just we're more local, and we use sticking plasters all over the place to get it to work. If you're running a big thing, then you've got to have it all working perfectly. If you haven't planned for that, it was obvious from the beginning that this was going to be a tough thing to put in place, and it really is. So the answer for getting the capacity up was to use every avenue you could. I used a Dunkirk metaphor. We were a little boat, they were the big destroyers. They needed to get much more effort to get them going. We, in the meantime, could have provided local services efficiently and effectively. It's probably the biggest failing, I would say, in the testing strategy that we've been following.
But Paul, when you talk about it to us and you say this is what they should have done and been prepared, and what it sounds, you know, just unbelievable that they couldn't have done that or put that into practice. And, you know, of course, the general public have been told the whole time we're led by the science. We are led by the science, but not really.
Well, you know, I don't know who made the decision to be just the big labs. We will find out eventually. It was probably had science advice in there, but this is actually more common sense than science. I mean, yes. Wouldn't you put everything you could into getting testing up? And if that meant little labs, you put it into little labs. You get the big labs developed. What we did is we emptied the universities and sent everybody home and closed the labs down. Don't think that's too smart to me.
Yeah. Well, that's a little bit depressing if they don't have that common sense, but we have to remain positive, Paul, don't we? And talking about positive things, you said that the grand challenge was unique. What makes it so different?
Well, I think there's several things that make it different. One is that it is truly international, and that means you break down barriers between countries, actually between continents, and you get a sort of buzz from mixing different cultures together, because although science works on fundamentally similar principles, there are different cultures in different countries, in different continents, and managed well, that can be very effective. A second reason is that it is truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, which is often required to tackle these big problems, because it's not just a single problem. there's all sorts of things that have to be solved to be able to actually get it in place. And perhaps one thing that isn't even focused on enough is that you tend to know what's going on around you better than what's going on in the rest of the world, even with you know, the new global world of the last decades. And being exposed in such a close way to different activities throughout the globe gets all those differences well connected. The US is a very successful science nation, although, of course, the present president isn't particularly good at science. And one of the reasons, though, that the US has been so powerful is because it's a big continent and it can pull on all sorts of different cultures within that. And what the Grand Challenges does is projects that way of working across the world.
You talked about their current president, Paul, and I have to ask you out of interest, because I don't know about everyone else, but I found it fascinating that he told everyone that he was taking the hydrochloroquine, the drug that treats malaria, and that he was taking it. Is that, I mean, is that dangerous or?
Well, you know, who knows what? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, this is a drug that has been used to deal with malaria. It's a rather old-fashioned drug. I think I had it 30 years ago when I went somewhere in the near the equator. It can have some side effects actually that you have to be careful about. There were some original thinking that maybe it could have a positive impact. I mean, I know what they are. It's probably a bit technical, but it's to do with the pH of the cells that get infected. There is very limited evidence in reality that it might be useful. But it is possible it could have an impact. There is a trial going on, so we just have to see. He has always been, for some reason, enthusiastic about it.
Yes.
I don't quite know why, but at least it's more sensible than, you know, injecting yourself with bleach or whatever he was talking about a few weeks ago.
Absolutely. Well, talking of impact, there's a question here, Paul. It says, what impact will the cut on research, Cancer Research UK funding due to COVID-19 will have on the progress to beating cancer?
Well, I think it will have a very negative impact. I mean, we hope it'll be short term, but just at the moment, I mean, I think I probably already mentioned it. There's a shortfall of 25%, and I think the recovery from that is likely to be slow. And so I think it's going to have a very significant impact.
Is it something that you're worried about?
Well, of course I worry about it, because the Cancer Research UK supports by far the majority really of cancer researchers in this country, many of whom I know, many of whom are doing excellent work, and to see that reduced in any way, I think is really not something one would like to see. I worry about it in the Crick. I mean, we've already had to have a cut because CRUK has had to cut what it can support because it doesn't have big reserves. So that's a problem for it. So I have to worry even in my day job about how I deal with the cut. I mean, which is something over 6 million, in fact, per year since April the 1st. So I'm worried personally for the Institute, but I'm also worried about the impact on the rest of the UK.
Paul, another question here. What is the current sensitivity and specificity of the PCR antigen testing for COVID-19, and its continued improvement realistic?
Right, so there's two things here that maybe have been a bit confused in the question, so I'll just separate them.
Okay.
PCR is polymerase chain reaction, and that is a reliable method that we use here that detects the nucleic acid that makes up the virus. It's an RNA, ribonucleic acid, and that's what's used to detect whether you are infected at that particular moment in time. The antigen test, which was also mentioned, is a test which detects whether you have antibodies in your body that react to the antigen, that's the proteins that make up the virus. And so in principle, that could tell you whether you've been infected by the virus. So that doesn't tell you whether you're infected at that moment, it tells you whether you've responded in the past to a viral infection. Now, ramping both of these things up to a high level takes a lot of effort. The PCR reaction is the one that we do here, and it's the one which was the famous 100,000 target of some weeks ago, you may recall. The next target will be one that detects the antigen, the antibody reaction, and that to put that in place is important because it allows you to tell if people have had the infection or not. But just a couple of comments about that. That doesn't tell you that you are still immune. And that's something that people think is the case. That can be the case, but sometimes the immunity is very short-lived. So until we know more about it, even if you're positive, you can't be absolutely sure that you're going to be immune. And so we have to be very careful about it. Getting these up to scale would be difficult. Now, what do we need to get up to scale? Well, I tell you, there's two things that are important. One is a properly articulated strategy, and we're not seeing that. It seems to be more sort of public relations. We're going to get to 100,000 tests, but then we don't know quite what to do with them. We need a proper strategy as to why we want to be to that numbers, how we're going to use them. So that's one thing. And the second, bluntly, is proper leadership. Leadership at all levels, in the science and medical communities, in the political communities. We need both strategy and leadership. And the reason I emphasize that is that this is going to go on for some time, many months. And we need to have better strategy and more effective leadership if we're going to get through this in an efficient way.
Gosh, Paul, so what I'm getting from you at the moment is that you don't believe our leadership is effective at the moment.
I think that it could be better.
Okay.
I think that, when you have 100,000 as an objective, I mean, you could say, well, that's to try and get to something important, but you need to know why you want to get there and how you're going to be using it. But when you get to 100,000 because you put tests in the post just to get to 100,000, I don't call that leadership.
Would you want to see more collaboration between scientists? I mean, obviously we hear Public Health England, we're always told that the leadership is led by the science, but why wouldn't they call on all scientists like yourself?
Well, what I think about that is that it may be a bit monolithic and it may run on rails somewhat. I mean, I've been thinking about this in the last months with this particular crisis. And I think we have to recognize that this is tough for the scientists, it's tough for the policymakers. So although I was being critical, I don't want to pretend for one moment that this is easy, because it isn't. I'm just saying we need good leadership and we need good strategy to get through it. So it is tough. And it's tough because we don't know enough about the virus to actually know exactly what to do. So even when you take the best scientific advice, we have to accept that it may not be the right advice. I mean, it's probably a very good guess, but it may not be right, and it will change over time as our knowledge increases. And perhaps having a much more open way of debating these issues, because everything's kept secret at this moment. There's this committee SAGE, but none of us know quite what it is doing or concluding. There's the Office of Life Sciences that seem to be involved, the Department of Health, Public Health England, and the National Health Service. By the way, I've just given you a list of names, and that's another problem. Who's taking responsibility for what? I mean, there's a governance issue in there. But if it had been more open, then other scientists, who know lots more than me, by the way, what I know about this virus, I've learned in the last 6 weeks. I mean, I'm no expert at it. Then they could be challenged more effectively, because we have to challenge to actually get the best way forward. So perhaps we need to rethink a bit about how we do this sort of thing. Less secrecy, more openness, more open debate. And that, once again, requires better leadership and the ability to admit that you may have got it wrong.
Okay. Well, Paul, there's another question here saying, are there parallels between looking for a cure for cancer and finding a cure for the virus?
Well, in science runs by similar principles, in the sense that it's the pursuit of truth. I often emphasize that with my PhD students. It's you're looking for truth. It's one of the great things about it. We respect evidence. We respect rational thinking. All of these things are common. There are differences, though, between dealing with a viral pandemic and dealing with cancer. In many ways, cancer is very much more complex. There's 300, 400, 500 genes in the human genome out of the 22,000, which are involved in cancer in all sorts of different ways. Whereas the virus, at least, is a foreign object and is relatively simple. So in some respects, dealing with the virus is quite a lot simpler problem. The difficulty with it is it's devastatingly infectious. It gets around when you don't know enough about it. We will beat the virus. There's no question about that. But the damage to get to it is with us now. With cancer, it's more steady state, but it's a more difficult scientific problem to solve. I hope I'm making myself clear, but that's the similarities, but there's a difference in a consequence of the nature of the problem.
No, absolutely clear. I think I've only got time for just one more question, Paul. Unfortunately, I apologise to those of you who haven't been able to ask one, but there's one here, Paul, that says, should people taking immunosuppressant therapy for hematological malignancy stop treatment because of coronavirus? Does the risk outweigh the benefits of continuing?
Well, this is a difficult question for me to answer, because the answer will depend on your precise conditions, the precise problem you have, and the stage that you're at. And I'm afraid I'm going to duck the question and say you need to ask your doctor, because who's treating you, who will be on top of all of that and give you the best answer. It's a complicated one to try and answer in a very general way.
So whoever's asked that question, please take Sir Paul's advice. And in view of your comments about the need of testing in respect to for early cancer detection, aka testing, one may consider them truisms that are not being listened to. Have you any other truisms related to biomedical research that should be listened to? And that will be our final question.
Oh my goodness, that was a...
that's from Alan Liddell. Thank you, Alan.
That's a googly. Then, well, truisms. The way we will beat disease is through science, understanding the disease, and then the proper applications of that knowledge to managing that disease, and the leadership to deliver all of that. That's more of a manifesto than a truism, but that's what I would say.
Okay, Alan, that's what he's saying to you. And can you see any positives in terms of conducting research from the effect of COVID?
Yes, there is a couple of things, actually. One is the way that we've all got together to sort of try and solve the problem. And in the case of the Crick Institute, we are working directly with hospitals in a way that we haven't done before. We've always tended to work with the medical schools that then connect to the hospitals. And I want to explore this way of working after the COVID crisis, because it just may be that it provides a new avenue, maybe only an extra avenue, by which we can see if we can help patients more directly by applying our skills, science and understanding directly in the clinical environment.
Right, Paul, I promise you this is really the final question. We're all not scientists like yourself, but we all have been touched in some way by cancer. How can we support all the important work that you are leading?
Well, I think I have to go back to Cancer Research UK. I've already said I'm worried on behalf of Cancer Research UK. It's seen this 25% drop in income. It's facing difficult times. And now is the time to make a difference, if I can put it that way. I mean, because they are in desperate need of support. And if you're able to support them, then this is the time when your donation or your support will really, really matter. So if you're thinking about that, get involved, get in touch with them and see what you might be able to do. And I'm sure every little thing will help.
So Paul, on behalf of all of us, and I'm sure I speak for everyone around the world who's listening into this webinar, it's been such a privilege, it's been such a pleasure to hear your incredibly inspiring discussion. Thank you for answering everyone's questions. It's been such an honor to hear from one of the world's most pioneering scientists. These are indeed challenging times for many, none so more than people living with cancer. They do need our help, both now and in the future. And to everyone listening, I would just like to echo Sir Paul's words earlier. Please get involved, please get in touch, whatever way you can. Please join us, and however you can, we need to improve the outcome for patients now more than ever. We need you, and of course, together we can and we will beat cancer. From myself, from Michelle, from Sir Paul, from all of us here at Cancer Research UK, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you good wishes, stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we'll all be able to see each other in person soon. Thank you so much to all of you.